Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you had a wonderful Lord's Day yesterday. And if you've got time to be able to study with us today, we're excited to jump back into the text of First Corinthians chapter 6. Michael Walls is with us. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. Having a good time.
Good. Terry, you're not at your regular craft station. Are you doing all right? Are you
Uh,
okay?
I'm doing good. I took a field trip today to my office. I forgot what it looked like. And it's partly motivated by Walls because he's finally out of the closet today, as you notice. And there are no fake book backgrounds behind him or any other things. So I
Feels
figured
good.
we'd have a real library behind us because of the three of us, I'm the only one I think that still has a real library.
I,
So
I have books somewhere.
somewhere, yeah. And just so everybody knows, I made sure to sit in front of the Florida College lectures just so you know where I stand.
Okay. Noted. I have a canoe paddle and a helmet. I mean, whatever. Walls is
I think
probably
you
using
need a
his.
tree behind you. We need a tree because, Michael, you know all good theology.
Comes from the garden.
Got
Yes,
it. That's right.
yes. I'm glad my cliches are making some impact on the world. We could probably track how many times Terry has accidentally said variations of that in the past couple days. But we are right now looking at chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians. And so let me move our way over there. We can get out of 1 Samuel, which I was reading earlier this morning, and move into chapter 6. And then, Michael, if you would, why don't you go ahead and start reading for us? We've got a larger text block here. We're going to break it up into a couple, like maybe two parts for us this morning. But let's go ahead and just read verses 1 through, I don't know, say 8 right now.
All right. That makes sense to me. When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare to go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you who wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers.
All right, so I've brought the whole chapter up here for a little bit because, the whole segment, in addition to Michael's reading. Um, so we've got some complicated things taking place. There's at least two questions that typically come out of this first part of First Corinthians chapter 6, and we're going to do our best to dig into both of them. Uh, but we're going to start with, I think, in some ways, the easy slash hard one. The easy slash hard one is dealing with lawsuits and grievances toward one another in that context. Beginning with verses 1, 2, 3. What do you guys see there that's important for us to understand? What do we want to know? What do we need to know, both in the language and also in the bigger picture of the text of First Corinthians?
Again, this goes back to they're already arguing about everything. This has been established every time, right? So not only are they fighting about who's the better preacher, who they're following, and all these other things, well, now they're actually suing one another. They're actually taking, and this might be controversial here, but what appears to me to be small, trivial things that I would liken to the equivalent of small claims court today. And they're taking those things to court to deal with, disputes. He uses the word dispute, trivial cases, defrauding several times throughout this context. So I know the other part of this is going to be the angels thing, but
Exciting.
But I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, this is people going to law over small things. I'm going to put it down right here. I don't believe this has anything to do with real serious legal issues at all.
Terry?
I think what's interesting is I tend to agree with Michael, but let me say this. This seems to be an easy text, but in some ways, I think this is like the most overlooked text of First Corinthians. like in some ways, I think very few people actually practice a lot of this stuff. And what I mean by that is, I mean, when was the last time you saw a dispute between members that they went to the elders to sort that out for them? Like I don't that happens. I mean, I've seen that, but it's
like
it's a
over
rarity.
money. Like again, he's talking about defrauding and
Yeah.
maybe bad business practices and things like that. I've not ever seen that. I've seen it over personal problems, Matthew 18 stuff. But to me, that would fit in the same category with this.
Yeah, and the other side of that is if you're not doing that, then I think verse 7, why not rather be defrauded, should be the attitude. Okay, if I'm not willing to go to the elders with this, then I'm just going to write this off as a loss and move on. And for the most part, I'd say at least 60% of the time, maybe 2/3 of the time, that's just not what we do. Like, we don't just wipe it away and we don't go to the elders. So we either complain about it or we talk to other. I mean, it's just interesting to me that I think this is really the smaller disputes. Although I will say, I think that there is some argumentation to be made, and I'll use divorce as an example. I mean, how much different would potential divorces between mates be if before they ran off to the lawyers, they sat down with the elders and discussed that? I mean, I think there's some applications, and that's by our standards. That's not some, just small claims court deal. That's a major deal. I think there's between brethren, I do think that there is ultimately kind of a principle here that even in those bigger matters, you really ought to seek out this wise counsel first before you even go. And that doesn't mean that that's not inevitable. And I've seen some people be, I think, unfairly criticized because let's say that something was a potentially large sum of things. It was a very illegal criminal thing. Sometimes people get criticized for not going to the elders and somebody gets arrested and they really don't have a choice in that. I think we have to be understanding in that. But there is in these cases between each other, even in the case of something like a divorce, I just think this passage is overlooked and not practiced because so often by the time that elders get involved in something like a divorce, the lawyer's already involved, the filing's already been made. And so as a result, you have this really bad mess on your hands. And so that's one of the things about this, just from a practical standpoint. We say, "Oh, this is simple," but nobody does it. Like I think that's pretty funny. I mean, when you think about it, and by nobody, I'm being very generous. Okay, Phil,
Yeah.
before you say, bring up your 5 examples out of your 38 years of preaching and going to the garden. So, I mean, just as a whole, we don't focus on this as much as we do chapter 5 or chapter 7 or any of those other chapters.
So I don't have 38 years of experience in going to the garden, nor do I have 5 examples, but I do have some things that I think help us separate the challenge. Michael brought in the point that he says he sees more minuscule matters in the context. I think that's certainly some good things to think, like it's probably moving in the realm as that we would use in American civil jurisprudence. We'd say civil law, criminal law. These are civil suits, and they're not big civil suits in context because the nature of their issues between one another aren't big issues. And so while we might say it could be any civil suit, that's not really what we're seeing here. These are not criminal matters. Secondly, though, I do think that there is a challenge for those of us who bring different experiences and baggage to the table when we look at the text to say, well, in my congregational experience, I haven't seen this. Well, you took a congregation that's got maybe 70%, 80% of its membership that's second, third generation within spiritually stable homes. Their problems are different than a congregation that's flipped around, that's got 20% of the congregation that came from spiritually stable homes that were taught to the gospel when they were, first able to hear things. And you got 80% that came out of the world. I can tell you that having worked with 2 different groups that kind of have those backgrounds, it's a big difference. The kind of troubles that the elders get asked to participate in are different in each of those groups. It's not that those groups don't have troubles, but the kind changes and the challenge to understand them change. And so you do end up seeing things that one group would call trivial, another group would call serious, the elders get brought into that dialogue. In the context here, it's not whether or not the elders involved. That's a big issue. The elders, the flock, the brethren should be knit together in a way that you have a moderator, you have someone to mediate, and every once in a while, that's something that has to happen. And being a good moderator and a mediator is hard. Like I've done it a little bit over the years, and it's tough. I got rules, and my rules have rules for me and for the group when we're doing that. But here, that's not the issue. The issue is they're not even doing that.
Yeah.
They're not even taking that step to work it out. And that's when we get to these two series of statements, verse 2, verse 3, that are increasing in hyperbole. They're literal statements, but they like raise the bar. Verse 2, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And he goes, do you not know that we are to judge angels? And this is where people's minds go,
Kaboom.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
You think that's because we want to lift it out of the context and make it something it's never intended to be? Like, that's the issue here.
I think there's some language issues. There's some translation issues. There's a whole lot of, and I'll talk about it again. This is my perspective, and so you guys may have wildly different experiences. But as a new convert, the first adult Bible class I was in I was told to join the Hebrew study that Howard Hooper was teaching. It was a great study.
Wow, that was deep.
Yeah, I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
We didn't even throw you in the deep end. We threw you in an ocean without a life jacket. This is what happened there.
Howard was one of the deepest thinkers I've ever known.
Yeah, and I was like, okay. And Michael's dad was in that Bible study, and like it was all like men who knew what they were doing, and I'm like, hi, I'm good to be here. But it was a lot of New Testament conversations, and then from Hebrews it went to bigger stuff, and so it was years before I started understanding the Old Testament story and seeing how that impacted things. And with all of that, and with that structure underneath it, when we see an angel and we don't have a good understanding of what God has done in the past, we're like, what's going on? Like, this is supernatural. I don't care anymore because I'm like living now. I think that's a struggle to understand. And so before we get into too much farther, what are your experiences with looking into this text and like how people respond to it? And how do you respond to it? What do you see going in there? I've got a few other things I want to add about the theology of it that hopefully won't bring up the garden, but it might.
Go, Terry.
No, I'm gonna let you go, Walls. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I'll try. So obviously there are references we can look to, right? Daniel talks about it a little bit. Jesus mentions this a little bit, but there's some things I think we can pretty easily disqualify. We're not talking about end time judgment here. That's Jesus' domain. So then what are we talking about? Phil used the word hyperbole. That's the direction I'm thinking. I'm lying with this. Is this talking about relative position? So God, through these passages, Daniel, Jesus, and maybe even here, Paul's using this, we're going to be kings, right? Now, ruling the kingdom of, what does that even mean? I mean, I don't think we have a real explanation for that. But where we are now is, we're peasants, we're peons, we're regular people. Most Christians are in that domain, right? And then you're going to be a king, you're going to be a noble, you're going to be great in the kingdom. And that's where I'm going. And to try to, I can't figure out the specifics of judging angels or ruling a kingdom like that what is there to rule in that sense, right? It's all going to be perfect. So I'm looking at this like, you're going to be this great thing there, and basically you're getting ready for that now. And so why wouldn't you go to one of these people, especially one of the elders, to sort these things out? But that's kind of how I'm looking at it these days. But like all angel passages, as Phil said, people just, their minds explode, and I think we want to write things in there that just aren't there.
Yeah. So I tend to think that this is more this escalation of kind of pointing out this inconsistency. And I think that the purpose is not to necessarily become and that's why I say context, a proof text about our role in judgment, especially end of times,
Mm-hmm.
but rather just to point out this inconsistency between who you're supposed to be and how you're acting. And I do think there's a little bit of this, by the way. I think one of the problems too is just the word angels. We automatically jump with angels to this idea of, somebody who's, in a way, I think sometimes we think of angels being sinless or perfect like Christ, and we forget about that whole concept in the scriptures of fallen angels and
Wait a minute,
those
don't do
who,
it. Careful.
yeah. But I mean, and again, we're dealing in a realm that I don't fully understand. I just know that to automatically assume that an angel is somebody without any flaws seems to be a mistake, even from a scriptural standpoint. And so all I'm saying, and in those cases where somebody's like that, then you could judge. For instance, I often think about the passage where the lying spirit goes out. I mean, are we allowed to say that spirit was wrong for lying? Yeah, we're allowed to make that judgment, right? Now we see how God used that, but the spirit in that story was able to decide and God does that the same way that, truthfully, he still uses people like Babylon to conquer Judah, people that are evil to work out his plan. So I think we all understand that. So a lot of just kind of me circling the wagons to kind of say, I think the overall point of this is really trying to say, hey, look, if anybody is qualified to make these judgments, it's not people outside of this group that are fleshly. It's the spiritual people. It's you that are spiritually minded, because you make spiritual judgments all the time, or you're supposed to. And I think that's more the overall idea than going, what does that mean that we judge angels? I think we get distracted by pulling that out of the context.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's both those points are certainly in the reading range of what's going on here. There's some misunderstanding of who angels are, why they're used here. I'll lay it out this way. I doodled at this point, kind of point out, which is drawing stuff is how I understand stuff. And I show it, but my penmanship is bad. So here's the way to think about it, at least how I think through it. There are 3 steps for us to consider. You can't judge between brethren, but you're supposed to judge between you and the world, and you're supposed to judge between you and the main messengers of God and see who Jesus is, because there's a sense of metonymy in play here. That's the other literary tool that Paul is using. He's expanding in a gradual sense to these really extreme scenarios, which is hyperbole, but now he has the Christian kind of standing in for the whole package of Christ in response to these other things. So it's not a theology thing of we're going to have an eschatology of the end times that says we're going to judge angels. It's like you're already doing that now. Like you should be doing that, and you're doing it simply because you've chosen to follow Christ. That makes you in contrast to the world and to angels in that sense too.
And wouldn't like Galatians 1, where Paul says, even if we or an angel tells you something other than this, let him be accursed. I mean, that is an encouragement in Galatians 1. You make a judgment even if an angel tells you something other than what this is. Or test the spirits, right? So there's these other passages that echo this sentiment, and I don't understand why it's so maybe difficult for us in that sense.
Because well, I'll add this, and I said I wouldn't, but I'm going to. Think back to when the serpent tempts Eve. All right, I haven't said the words.
No,
I haven't said the words.
You're right. You're right.
Go back to the garden walls. That's what he wants to say.
And we forget to pay attention that the way that is worded is, and I've described the kind of language this way. Satan has a crew already with him when he goes to tempt Eve. It's the language is that way. The Hebrew, Greek in this case, is that way, and probably the Hebrew too. That really has this look. He's not alone. We see him as alone because we've translated it that way, and we want to think about it just the serpent. But he's got a crew that's with him because the heavenly realm is more than just the devil, and he's got minions later down the road. He's got his own gang, his own press gang that he's put into service. And so now when Paul says, if an angel says, really, that there are spiritual beings that will lie to you. We think they're perfect, but they're not. And so you make that judgment in layered basis. And Eve should have made that judgment too. She should have looked at the serpent and said, "Get behind me, Satan." You know. So there's a sense to that it is Paul is using that understood truth to teach them the truth they need to hear.
Yep.
I mean, the characteristics of Christians, right? There should be some level of common sense, and I get everyone's in a different maturity state, but things like honesty and truth matter to a person who's a believer, and so they should be better at these decisions. And as you guys said, we're having to determine truth from fiction or good doctrine from bad doctrine all the time. How is it that somehow we can't figure out who's right or who's wrong in a case of some kind of bad business deal or something? I mean, the Old Testament sort of spells out, right, what you're supposed to do, and so we already have great guidelines for those kind of things.
Yeah, Mark Russell, I'll answer your question later. There is a flow chart that involves angels that will explain all of this. I'll bring it up later. It'll be in the chat.
Somehow it involves a serpent around a tree in the garden.
There is a flow chart. It'll be excellent, but I can't do that right now. We got to move forward. We've already spent a good amount of time. I think we've got a good spot to kind of jump forward to. So in verses 5 through,
Bill, quickly, let me say one thing real quick. I do want to caution people to realize that I do know of cases where people have involved the elders to make judgments. And please understand, most of the time, you're not going to know about that. I mean, if this is done correctly, it's also done privately.
Yes.
So I do want to point out that I do know more of 5 cases. But I also know that there's a lot of cases that are handled not privately and not with the elders that should be handled this way. And that's really my overall point about how we apply this passage.
I'm going to guess that not a lot of us, until we get more mature, have connected this to Matthew 18, right? Like we did today, and that whole concept that you're talking about. We focus on the lawsuit part rather than what should be happening behind the scenes, as you said.
Yeah, and Tim Beckley mentioned earlier, just to throw this in before you move forward, about relationships involvement in that. That's a huge part of this. If you don't have good relationships with your shepherds and with each other, you're not going to practice this. And that goes back to the problem of Corinth anyway. I mean, their relationships were not where they should be. So many of these things, we're going to keep coming back to that idea over and over again that, well, this is about relationships. Yeah, their relationships are terrible. That's really in the first 4 chapters, that's what he's been dealing with. Sorry, Phil, we just needed to take that.
I think there's some important stuff there. And I'll add this, we have a culture right now that is unwilling to accept expertise on anything. Well, I read it on the internet that Abraham Lincoln said, or I read on the internet that if you use this taco sauce, that it's better than that taco sauce. Okay, well, those are not equivalents. Tacos are great, and I might be an expert in those things, but it's not the same thing as compared to the expertise to discern historical motives. Nor is it the same thing to understand or discern the expertise of medical issues or legal issues, or what does the text say. There's expertise in all of those categories, and this culture at Corinth was outsourcing their expertise questions to unrighteous sources rather than within ones that have the same moral fiber and moral structure that were available to them, elder or not. There are wise brethren that do this kind of mentoring all the time.
Well, and along those lines, Phil, the elders aren't necessarily experts. But if they don't have the kind of character where you can trust them with these kind of judgments, they shouldn't be your elders. I mean, and that's a whole nother broadcast. But I think one of the things we got to understand is those requirements or qualifications or characteristics or whatever you want to say in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, they don't point to being some great administrator. They point to having the character to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
And I think that's just something to be understood.
Yeah, I think we'd add one more thing. I think this is kind of the last ideas of verses 6, 7, 8. Why isn't your attitude the attitude that says, I'll just choose to be defrauded because I don't want to bring shame to my brethren, to myself, to my Lord, especially because we're dealing with things that contextually seem smaller rather than bigger. Again, I don't believe any of this has to do with criminal behavior. I will say, based on the history of Corinth and the history of the church at Corinth, this is very petty and very low in this value standard side of things. And so, why not have a heart that just says, that's not a big deal. You borrowed my mower and didn't bring it back.
Yeah,
I'm going to go on.
and a lot of this has to do with perception, right? One, you should have that sort of humble attitude, but two, Paul gets to in this other section. This is out in front of everybody, and this is to your shame that one, you're even entertaining these problems, but two, then you're going to law. Now everyone gets to see it. You're airing your dirty laundry. I mean, it kind of says something similar later on when he's talking about spiritual gifts, right? If everyone's speaking in tongues, the outsiders are going to think you're out of your mind, right? In 14:22. And to me, it's a similar issue here. It's one thing to be doing this. It's wrong, it's foolish, and there's way better options. But there's another side of this, and that it just looks really bad on the church. And why would people, we say this all the time, why would people want to be Christians if the Christians are acting like everyone else?
Yeah.
What's the benefit?
Yeah, and we would rather, I mean, here's the idea. We don't want to suffer. Like, I think that's one of our problems is, and that's really what he's saying there. Why won't you suffer wrong for the sake of unity? But instead, you want to make the other guy suffer wrong for the sake of unity, and it's always interesting. Like, it's like to bring up a text we don't really want to talk about much, but Romans 14, nobody ever goes in Romans 14 going, I'm the weaker brother, right? It's always the other guy who's weaker. And I think it's that same mentality, like what, and I think of this passage here, you really parallel this idea of why won't you suffer for somebody else to Philippians 2 and talking about putting the interest of other people first and just see how those go together. I think it's really interesting to kind of make that connection and say, we're really not in that case, in these cases, they're not acting like somebody who would hang on a cross for other people. So at the core, what this is really about is they're just not being Christ-like at all. Why wouldn't you give up this kind of small, trivial amount of money for the sake of the unity of the church? By the way, we won't even do that about things that aren't even money. Like, I mean, think about how many ridiculous kind of silly fights and divisions have happened over the years because we wouldn't be defrauded. I just think that may be that 7 and 8 may be the most important text in the whole chapter. Hey, sometimes you just need to write it off and move on.
Let's go ahead and read verses 9, 10, and 11. It's one of those passages that we tie together with earlier parts. Terry, you want to read that for us?
Sure. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God.
All right, so the typical use of this text is to tell us that these are the people who won't go to heaven. That's like the number one use of the passage, regardless of a person's spiritual heritage. And I'll say it's the number one worst way to use the text to understand what Paul is trying to teach. It's not that those things aren't true, but he's not teaching us that here. He teaches that us those things elsewhere. So what is he trying to teach us here in 9, 10, and 11?
Well, you got a connection back to the first paragraph, right? Verse 8, you yourselves wrong and defraud, even from your own brothers. And then he goes right into this. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? You're unrighteous. This whole thing you're doing is unrighteous. And then I was looking at this, like, you're right. We just go to this sort of big passage here, but there's almost like two layers, and this is in human terms. I'll use a Paulism here. I'm speaking in human terms. It's like Paul says there's sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, men who practice homosexuality. Those are bad sins. And then there's thieves, greedy, drunkards, revilers, swindlers. Those are not so bad sins, right? Again, I'm speaking in human terms. And so all of those are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. And you were all of those and still are in some ways. And so I wonder that he's making that's how I saw it. He's making that sort of comparison. Like, you think it's not so bad, but it's just as bad.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key points there that are important to catch. That this was whom they were, and Michael's right, at least my look at the text, who they are. Because you can kind of connect each of the terms here to their behavior, even in the immediate context of chapter 6, the prior context of chapter 5, the overall letter there. He's reminding them of who they sought to become. I think that's my primary heart of the text is verse 11. You were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified. Live like it, act like it, move like it. Seek to stay in that sense. Terry?
Well, yeah. So, chapter 5, you think that whole discussion was about a sexually immoral man, right? So here we have a guy who was washed, sanctified, and justified, but he's gone back to, or maybe never left, but at least at the very more likely has gone into this behavior that he was supposed to have left. And so it's building this case, and I think it is this bridge even to verse 12, which is this idea of sacrifice, right? So you were supposed to be changed, but you're really not. You've really not left those things behind. I think one of the things that's interesting, though, that we often point out, and I think there's a point to this is, I mean, who they were, and to a degree who they still were, was also well known, right? And I think maybe one of the things we point out is, well, this is who they were. And Paul's kind of saying, you're still acting this way. And I think maybe, to me, it's maybe not that there's men, for instance, who are still practicing homosexuality, but what he's trying to say here is, yeah, you've left some of those things behind, but you've not changed enough. Like, you've not left the world behind. You've not become like Christ like you're supposed to. And I think that's really the idea. I don't know necessarily, like I said, in chapter 5, we really understand, yes, there were still sexually immoral people. I think as a general whole, the real problems here are the division and some of those things, and they just didn't stack those up to these other like 7 deadly sin kind of things, right? They didn't, oh, at least we're not this. Hey, not going to the garden, but we'll go back to the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of like chapter 5, right? Well, I'm not an adulterer. I can lust, but I'm not an adulterer, right? That kind of idea. I think that's what you see here as well. And the idea was, hey, you're supposed to be different. And you tie that back, and the way you're handling these disputes, it's not different than anybody else. And that's really, I think, one of the great things about this chapter is you see this lawsuit, you see this sexual immorality. The connecting theme between these sections is just this. It's kind of that Romans 12:2 thing. You're not like the world anymore. You were sanctified and washed and justified. You've been set apart. You're different. Start acting different.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, great message for us today, because we don't act different today either. I mean, in a lot of ways. I mean, we do. Again, I speak in hyperbole and generality if you've not already figured that out. But we are far too comfortable looking more like the world than like the Lord. And I think that's their problem as well.
Doesn't every New Testament and every Old Testament author say that same thing, that same refrain, like a broken record? You know, it's not just judges, right?
Yeah.
Everyone, you look too much like everyone else. And usually that shows up as idolatry and sexual morality and all these, you know, again, littler things.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, guys, so we got about 15 minutes to try to cover another challenging text, and so we're going to do our best. We're not going to cut it up and snip it. But I am thinking it's important for us to read the text together, and there's a good connection to what Paul has just been teaching. This is like a personal application, or it's his invitation to be like me. Paul says that a lot with, follow me as I follow after Christ. So given what he just said, he continues, verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and stomach for food. And God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord, and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. So I apologize I didn't scroll the text there for everybody, but we're going to back it up to verse 12. In the text itself, there's quite a bit that is able to be read side by side with the instruction in the first 11 verses. At least as a kicking off point, I see in this text not so much as a list of do's and don'ts, but Paul making a big Pauline argument where he is employing all of his rhetorical skills as to how foolish it would be to think that how you behave in one place doesn't matter and how you behave in another place. And he's illustrating the ironic approach they've developed towards their spiritual behavior. Hey, I can go to law against this stuff, my brother. It doesn't matter. And he says, well, all things are lawful for me, but they're not all helpful. And then he makes a series of harder and harder challenging issues. And pay attention to, like, Paul is writing this from the perspective of a single man, without our understanding of why he's made all those choices beyond the simple point of it's expedient for the gospel. But he writes to married men. He writes to men and women who have struggled with sexual identity and sexual practice. And he talks about those issues in the context of their relationships. So it says, you're struggling with this already. Giving up that kind of sinful behavior is hard. For those who live in those lifestyles and then step out of them, it's a constant struggle, just like it is with alcoholism, with the work of your speech, with the work of your hands. They're all the same. And so Paul is really giving us a powerful message of submission to God, to Christ, and to others. All right, now run with the ball that I just threw you. Don't fumble in the end zone, and do something better with it. What do you guys see in the text?
Well, look, I think if you're going to proof text anything from this, it's got to be chapter 12. And I know we're not fans of proof texting, but there is this overarching principle has to be applied. Goes back to the defrauding. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And I got to tell you, that statement alone applies to our current situation so well, right? Because there's so much, especially this weekend, about rights and what my right is and what you can't take away my rights. And part of the point of this is that you have some rights that you give up because of other people. And that's just, and by the way, that goes back to Philippians 2, 3, and 4, right? I mean, that's really what Philippians 2, 3, and 4 is saying. Yeah, you have a right to have your opinion, but you put other people's opinions ahead of your own, like their desires, their interests, their wants. And so again, I'm just going to tell you, and this is not hyperbole. I think a lot of times the problems in the church are caused because we're not willing to submit to somebody else. Most of those problems aren't doctrinal. The problems that churches have aren't doctrinal. They're really opinion based, and they're because you are so rooted in you being able to do this thing, and you're not willing to give it up for the sake of the kingdom and the sake of the church and to glorify God. So, this statement, by the way, goes against everything we're raised to be in America. Let's be honest. We are raised from an early age, and I love the Constitution, so don't accuse me of not loving that. And I love the rights we have. But sometimes we're too tuned into our rights to the point that and I think, look, Walls is the history guy, and he understands that a lot better than me. One of the things that bugs me is a lot of people claim to have a God-given right, which is not a God-given right at all. But just because it's in the Constitution doesn't mean it's God-given. We struggle with all of that. So, and the other thing I'd point out in this section is, if children under 18 you may want to cover their ears. This food is for the stomach for the food. The body's not meant for sexual immorality. I will say this. The context of this is the body's not meant for sexual immorality, but the other side of that is that the marriage bed is undefiled, and we are created to be in that kind of relationship within the proper boundaries. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind here is that part of the design is that desire for intimacy. So this isn't saying, as you're going to get into in chapter 7, we're transitioning, right? Just don't touch a woman. That's not what this is saying. This is saying, hey, you got to do that in the proper boundaries. And we're transitioning there as well. So just to point that out, the promiscuous has to end, right? The very promiscuous behavior. And so those are the two things that just pop to me. Walls, you can clean all that up.
I will try. I mean, Paul does discuss this idea of subordinating your rights to others, right? In chapter 9, you mentioned Romans 14. That's exactly what those chapters are about. You know, I'm going to do what I have to do. In chapter 9, I'll be to, people without law, I'll be without law, except I'll be still under law to Christ. And that's the limiting factor, right? So I think a lot of this is not just an American problem. I think it's one we all share, but this seems to be a human problem. And the Romans had some level of this too, I guess, some level of legality to their rights, some of them anyway. But the stomach thing, I mean, that reminded me of Philippians 3. I already kind of touched on it. Their God was their belly, right? This is representative of lust and just carnal desire and nature. And so what better way to illustrate that than the sexual relationship? And what better way to talk about purity than to remind them that this is not what it's for? And in a city, in an area that's known for promiscuity of all sorts, even in their religious practice. So he's kind of like hammering on this issue. I don't know how much of that did the Corinthians bring with them as they were converted to Christ. And this is something I talk about in my history classes often, is that people grow up with certain expectations or certain things that are normal. And you guys mentioned it already. Bill did, a church that's made up of mostly people that have been Christians for several generations are going to have a very different experience. It's because their normal is different. Their expectations are different. And then when those get challenged, people tend to bow up and fight. And so here Paul is challenging their normal, which is, you want to worship your God, you go to the temple, you go to a prostitute, you do your thing. And it's both gratifying and you're worshiping. And what better way to do that is there? And he says, no, that's totally impure. I think people make too much out of this idea that this sin is up against the body and other sins aren't. Again, this is just Paul saying this is about purity. All sins are bad. All sins are equally bad. You certainly wouldn't want to pull anything like that out of here. But these people were supposed to be holy, which brought me to Peter, right? Be holy, for I am holy. And they just had fallen flat. They were believers. We talked about how they were saints, and Paul's saying you were this. It's not escaped them any more than we've escaped it either.
Well, and there's also a connection here between this, especially the end of chapter 6, chapter 15, Philippians 3. You don't necessarily see the resurrection pointed out clearly in this text until you kind of connect those dots. And the idea that you were bought with a price, glorify God in your body. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 15, bringing that idea that the way you live in your body is sowing seeds for the resurrection. That's the illustration that's used. What you do in your body is like a seed, not in the garden, Phil, before you try to go back over there, but the seeds planted for the resurrection. You connect that to Philippians 3, where we were with the young guys, I guess it was a couple weeks ago, and the idea of I do all of this for the sake of the resurrection, and that I might gain that body. So there's some connections between those when you start drawing those lines between those dots, and you kind of make this connection. Hey, look, the way you live in your body has an impact on your eternity.
Yeah.
And what you receive. And so I just want to point that out when you draw those dots, just the connectivity there between those passages.
So if you start reading the story of Israel side by side with the story of Christians in Corinth, there's some things that can kind of come up. One, Israel is bought; they're purchased. Their freedom is purchased by God at the price of significant blood. And then God provides them a place to worship. He eventually gives them a temple to see God in. Starts with the tabernacle, eventually becomes the temple that's in Jerusalem. The Christians, they're bought, they're purchased. And eventually, then they are able to see the kingdom and see that they themselves are part of the temple of God. And sometimes their bodies are shown to us as being part of the temple. And there's a great picture. And I think Mark's right, by the way. We had other earlier great comments. We didn't get a chance to comment on all of them, trying to squeeze chapter 6 into one thing. But there's some literary things taking place here. And sarcasm starts the rung of climbing up that ladder to understanding. But here's where the parallel comes back in. Israel purchased, given a temple, given a place to worship. The prophets then speak of their demise regularly as significant and horrible adultery. You were given a proper relationship with God, and then you brought in prostitutes. You went a whoring, as some of the old King James text will say. And then now Paul uses that same thing. He uses that same basic illustration that using a close, committed relationship of husband and wife becomes the illustration of spiritual rebellion at its deepest level. And when we talk about it in that way, it should sting and it should hurt. I think Terry has a great illustration to talk about the proper marriage bed. I think it's something about an amusement park and bringing your wife there. I don't know. I'll drop him some bait if he wants to use that cliche and get in big trouble. But maybe we'll bring it up. See, I look at he's turning 3 shades of pork red right now, so I think I've won the battle.
Won the battle. I mean, I'll share it. It was not my illustration, but the question was once asked, how do you what are you allowed to do within the marriage union? And I've used this in counseling because this is an issue. I mean, we live in a culture where intimacy between married couples is very difficult because of influences from outside presences. Like, let's just be honest, pornography has had a tremendous impact on marriages today. It is so accessible, and our young men grow up with, quite frankly, a unreal expectations of what that's going to look like. Okay. So the question came up one time, and a friend of mine explained it this way. It's like you can go to Six Flags together and the whole park is shut down. It's just the two of you, and you can ride any ride as many times as you want, as long as you both agree to ride that ride. And that was the explanation of just the mutual agreement. And so since Phil tossed it out there, it's a tame way of explaining how to keep your marriage bed undefiled and how to keep it from becoming immoral. And I think that really ties in, by the way, to verse 16.
Mm-hmm. There's a reason I put the bait out.
Huh?
There's a reason I dropped the bait.
Yeah. The two become one flesh. And this applies in every area of marriage. You are one. You are not two roommates living together who practice intimacy. You are one unit, one flesh. There is no distinction between the two of you. And that's important. And by the way, this is not an American thing. That's where we really struggle. It's like Michael said, we are just selfish. I think somewhat by nature or trained to be, whichever way you want to talk about that. And that creeps into our marriages, and we don't practice this one flesh idea. So there you go. Bait accepted and shared, Phil.
I think that also kind of then helps us better understand the last clauses. Verse 16 is really why I brought it in. There was a reason to drop the bait, because this was an issue for them. He's using these hyperbolic type statements in a way to teach them about some underlying truths, that they had lost their view of what God called holy, what a holy relationship looks like, marriage or not, and what kind of relationship they had with their king and the captain of their salvation. They were destroying the temple of God. They do that. He uses that terminology a couple times later in the text. that helps us kind of process what are we going to do with this stuff. And Christians should look weird to the world. Chuck Richardson had that comment, we must learn to view our Christian walk apart from the cultural practices, even if though they're lawful. We make weird choices as Christians as to how we solve things as the world sees normal. And that should be normal for us and stay weird for them. And far too often we do not stand out spiritually because of those choices, because we're afraid or ignorant or any number of spaces in between those two things. So let's walk around the horn real quick. It's 50 after. It's a tough text, and I kind of expected that would be the case for today. Terry, any last thoughts?
I love that last statement. You're not your own. You're bought with a price. Glorify God in your body. I mean, if you could live that today, you'd be better off.
Michael?
Yeah, I was going to grab onto that one too. There's your it's my body, I can do whatever I want argument is blown out of the water right here for abortionists or anyone, right? It's my body. But man, people just aren't thinking, right? They're thinking with their belly, to go back to previous statement. And we've got to work really, really, really hard to get away from that, because that's our downfall. That is individual our downfall, and collectively our downfall is thinking with our belly and not being holy, right? Because those are two opposite things.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. We tend to get our wants and desires way out ahead of what God has said. This will make you better. And his better is not the world's better. Your better might be suffering. Your better might be trial. Your better might be blessing, in the sense of economic blessing. Maybe you need to be the person who manages the money for everybody else. Maybe that's what you need to be doing, but you're afraid to. And to do that's hard. Maybe you need to serve as a lawyer or a doctor. Hal talked earlier about how we'll go to those guys who are unrighteous, but we won't go to the righteous shepherds. Well, what about being a shepherd who is a lawyer, or a shepherd who is an MD? How many of you guys would rather have that going on, because they're experts of the things and they have a holy heart? I think Paul is trying to build us to understand, in part of this transition, what he's going to talk about next. He's a sequential writer. And so they're not independent chapters. Chapter 7, verse 1 is going to be another great text. We'll look at that and following tomorrow. Thanks, Michael, for joining us. Thanks, Terry, for being part of the study. Thanks, everybody else. As we've been talking about in the course of our studies, we believe, most specifically and openly, that the kingdom of heaven is real and that God wants you to be part of it. Our desire then is to help you in any way that you can learn more about Jesus and his word. If we can do that, reach out to us. If you've got questions about the Bible and our regularly normal broadcasts, which are all preacher stuff, let us know about that stuff too. But in everything and in all ways, may God bless you.